For weeks, the Atlantic Ocean did something meteorologists almost never see this deep into hurricane season. Nothing happened. No named storms. No organized systems. Nothing but quiet water sitting under a strong El Nino pattern that forecasters expected to keep the entire basin suppressed for months. Then, almost overnight this week, that silence broke. And the way it broke has forecasters rethinking what the rest of the season might actually look like. Meteorologists had genuinely started describing the Atlantic in almost eerie terms, with one veteran hurricane researcher openly calling the basin a ghost town in his tropical updates through early July. That kind of language rarely shows up during hurricane season, and it reflected just how confidently forecasters believed this particular year would stay quiet. The fact that an actual named storm managed to form and make landfall despite that level of confidence is exactly what makes this week's turn worth paying close attention to. Here is exactly what shifted. A tropical depression quietly formed in the Gulf of Mexico, and within days it organized into Tropical Storm Bertha, the second named storm of the entire 2026 Atlantic hurricane Louisiana, early Wednesday morning, bringing storm surge up to 3 feet and sustained, winds as high as 60 miles per hour. For a season, forecasters had spent months describing as quiet, muted, and suppressed. Watching an organized tropical storm actually make landfall on the U.S. Gulf Coast is exactly the kind of turn nobody had penciled in for this particular week. In the days leading up to landfall, tropical storm watches and coastal flood warnings stretched across a wide swath of the northern Gulf Coast, covering New Orleans and southern Louisiana, extending into coastal Mississippi and Alabama, and prompting close monitoring as far west as the upper Texas coast and as far east as north-central Florida. That kind of geographic spread, covering multiple states, bracing for potential impacts from a storm that essentially materialized out of what had been described as hostile atmospheric conditions just days earlier, underscores exactly how quickly this situation evolved from a quiet season into an active regional weather emergency. To understand why this caught so many people off guard, you need to understand just how thoroughly this Atlantic season had been written off before Bertha ever formed. Colorado State University's lead hurricane forecaster, Phil Klotzbach, had spent weeks describing the tropical Atlantic as sitting, under mixed to hostile conditions for development driven largely by an intensifying El Nino pushing unusually high wind shear across the Caribbean Sea, among the highest ever recorded for early July. Forecasters at the National Hurricane Center and NOAA had both revised their outlooks downward multiple times, and just weeks before Bertha formed, one major forecast update predicted only 9 named storms and a single major hurricane for the entire season, a significant reduction from earlier spring projections. Local forecasters covering the Gulf Coast region had gone so far as to describe July as offering little to no sign of life in the tropics, with outlooks projecting continued quiet conditions extending at least 2 more weeks, with no development expected. That level of confidence, expressed just days before Bertha's formation, reflects genuinely sound meteorological reasoning based on the atmospheric conditions in place at the time, which is exactly why the storm's sudden arrival registered as such a meaningful surprise, rather than simply another routine update to an already active season. Here is the twist that makes this moment genuinely worth paying attention to. Even as Bertha formed in an atmosphere that was supposed to be hostile toward development, the ocean water underneath it told a very different story. Sea surface temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico are running unusually warm this year, and meteorologist Jeff Berardelli, chief meteorologist and climate specialist at WFLA in Tampa Bay, described the effect in blunt terms, comparing the warm Gulf water to high-octane fuel for a storm, since it is running noticeably warmer than normal right now. In other words, even in a year forecasters expected to suppress tropical activity, the raw fuel sitting beneath the surface remained fully capable of igniting a storm the moment conditions allowed it. Berardelli's fuel comparison captures something meteorologists have been trying to communicate more clearly to the public in recent years: the idea that atmospheric conditions and ocean temperature act almost like 2 separate ingredients in storm formation, each one capable of either encouraging or restraining a system depending on how they interact. Suppressive wind shear can keep a storm weak or prevent it from forming at all, even when warm water sits directly beneath it, but the moment that shear relaxes, even briefly, an unusually warm ocean is ready to respond immediately, which is essentially what happened this week, when Bertha found a narrow window of more favorable conditions. If you are finding this breakdown genuinely useful, go ahead and hit that like button right research-backed weather stories like this one, straight from the meteorologists tracking every twist in this pattern. This tension between a suppressed atmosphere and an unusually warm ocean underneath it is exactly what forecasters have been warning about all season, even while predicting fewer storms overall. Jamie Rome, deputy director of the National Hurricane Center, has been consistent in cautioning that a below-average storm count does not mean a low-risk season, urging, people not to underestimate the potential power of individual storms simply because El Niño is expected to limit how many form. Bertha's sudden appearance this week is precisely the kind of event that validates that warning, arriving despite an atmosphere forecasters described as broadly hostile to development. Fortunately for residents along the Gulf Coast, Bertha's specific track spared the region from the worst possible outcome. Strong wind shear from the northeast, the same broader atmospheric pattern suppressing the wider season, worked in the storm's disfavor at exactly the right moment, pushing the bulk of its rain and wind offshore and preventing the kind of slow-moving, catastrophic flood event that has devastated Gulf communities in past seasons. Rome noted that as long as that pattern continued to play out, Louisiana in particular stood a real chance of dodging the worst of the impacts, a forecast that appears to have held up as the storm made its final approach, with isolated flash flooding remaining the primary lingering concern from western Florida through the upper Texas coast, rather than a widespread, prolonged flooding disaster. But the story does not end simply because this particular storm turned out to be more of a warning shot than a catastrophe. Klotzbach has pointed to a broader trend that deserves genuine attention heading into the rest of this season. Over the past 30 years, the total number of hurricanes forming across the Atlantic has actually decreased. Yet the percentage of those storms reaching powerful Category 4 and 5 status has increased. As Klotzbach put it, when ocean waters run warmer than normal, that tends to load the dice towards stronger storms overall, even in a season where the total number of storms is expected to stay below average. That single sentence captures exactly why meteorologists are treating this week's sudden Atlantic activity with more caution than the raw numbers alone might suggest. A season defined by fewer storms is not automatically a season defined by less danger. If anything, a smaller number of storms forming in unusually warm water can concentrate risk into fewer, potentially more intense systems, rather than spreading it across a larger number of weaker ones. Bertha may have arrived and passed without producing catastrophic damage, but the underlying ocean conditions that helped fuel its formation have not gone anywhere, and they remain available to fuel whatever storm forms next. This is precisely why experienced hurricane researchers keep repeating the same warning every single season, regardless of how the overall numbers are trending. A quiet season on paper can still produce the one storm that matters most to the people directly in its path. And the specific combination shaping this year, suppressed overall storm counts paired with unusually warm fuel sitting just beneath the surface, is arguably one of the more difficult patterns to communicate clearly to the public. It does not fit neatly into either the reassuring story of a mild season or the alarming story of an unusually active one. And that in between, quality is exactly what makes weeks like this one so worth watching closely rather than dismissing based on the season's overall storm count so far. There is also a broader global dimension to this story worth understanding. The same strengthening El Niño pattern, suppressing Atlantic hurricane activity, is simultaneously supercharging tropical activity elsewhere on the planet. Earlier this month, Super Typhoon Baby reached near Category 5 intensity in the Western Pacific, producing a wind field so massive that tropical storm force winds extended across more than 10 degrees of longitude, with waves near the storm's center reaching heights of roughly 80 feet. That is, the same broad atmospheric engine, an intensifying El Niño reorganizing where heat and energy concentrate around the globe, suppressing development in one ocean basin while dramatically amplifying it in another. That kind of global redistribution of storm energy is a pattern meteorologists have documented across previous strong El Niño years as well, and it offers an important reminder that a quiet Atlantic season does not mean the planet as a whole is experiencing a quiet year for tropical weather. The same atmospheric shifts that pushed high wind shear across the Caribbean, making it harder for Atlantic storms to organize, simultaneously created far more favorable conditions across the Western Pacific, where Bavi found exactly the warm, deep ocean water it needed to intensify into one of the most powerful storms anywhere on the planet this year. Meteorologists tracking global sea surface temperature patterns have also noted something else worth understanding about how this El Niño is reshaping the broader picture. Even with extraordinary warming across the central and eastern Pacific, significant pockets of cooling have shown up simultaneously in the North Atlantic and around parts of the Pacific near Asia, creating a strange situation where the global average temperature signal has remained surprisingly steady, even as individual regions experience wildly different extremes depending on exactly where they sit relative to this reorganizing pattern. What all of this adds up to is a genuinely more complicated picture than the simple, comforting headline of a below-average hurricane season might suggest. Yes, the Atlantic has produced fewer storms so far this year than a typical season would by this point in July. But this week's sudden appearance of Tropical Storm Bertha, forming and strengthening despite an atmosphere meteorologists had spent weeks describing as broadly hostile, is a clear reminder that suppressed does not mean safe, and that the warm water fueling these systems has not disappeared just because the wind patterns above it have made storm formation more difficult. For anyone living along the Gulf Coast or the broader Atlantic seaboard, the practical takeaway from this week's turn is straightforward. Continue treating hurricane season with the same seriousness, regardless of how quiet any particular stretch has felt, since the same conditions that allowed Bertha to form largely unexpected this week remain firmly in place for the rest of the season. Review evacuation plans, check insurance coverage, and stay alert to forecasts, because, as this week demonstrated clearly, a supposedly suppressed Atlantic season is still fully capable of producing a storm with very little warning. Federal disaster response organizations have echoed that same message throughout this season, urging communities not to let a quieter than average forecast breed complacency heading into the historical peak months of August, September, and October, when Atlantic tropical activity traditionally rises dramatically regardless of what any single storm earlier in the season managed to do. Bertha's arrival this week may end up being remembered as a relatively minor chapter in this year's hurricane season, but the pattern behind it, warm water quietly waiting beneath a suppressed atmosphere, is exactly the kind of setup forecasters will be watching closely as the calendar moves toward the months when this season's real test is still expected to arrive. If you want to stay ahead of how this unpredictable season continues to unfold, make sure you are subscribed to this channel so you never miss an update. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one.